Hello, my name is Paul Lindley, and I'm the founder of Ella's Kitchen, the biggest baby food company in the UK. And amongst other things, I now sit on the board of trustees of Sesame Workshop, and I'm proud to chair Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights here in the UK. And I want to welcome you to the RFK Campus Live virtual fireside chat. And it's one where we get to have a conversation with one of the giants of British politics over the last 2 decades. And I hope the next 2 decades too, Ed Miliband. Now, Ed has been a Member of Parliament since 2005. He served as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change under Prime Minister Gordon Brown, and then became leader of the Labour Party itself for 5 years, contesting the 2015 general election from that position. He is now Shadow Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which includes in his remit Labour's position on the COP26 in Glasgow this month, and is a leading voice in setting out Labour's vision for the future. He also co-presents the influential podcast, Reasons to be Cheerful. So please do subscribe, it's very, very good. And this year wrote a best-selling book, Go Big, How to Fix Our World, which is also very much worth buying. And as a declaration of interest, Ed is also a good friend. So he's a man that knows a lot about politics, business, the economy, and the environment. And today we're going to wrap it all together with human rights to see what we can learn from our conversation. So welcome, Ed.
Paul, thank you so much. And it's a real privilege and an honor to be part of this conversation.
Well, you're very welcome. We've got 30 minutes or so to pick your brains and really find something from your experience that I'm sure will resonate. Now, our chat today, Ed, is in front of the world's finest asset owners and asset managers. People thinking seriously about things like the future of prosperity, of growth, of the economy, and how they as influencers can do the right thing in their investment decisions and in their actions. And so as a starter, I was thinking they're people who want to go big themselves. So that's where I'd like to start with your book, which I know prominently quotes Bobby Kennedy, and he's a big inspiration to you. And you quoted his speech about GDP itself in the book. And I'd ask you to share some thoughts about why you wrote it, what it's about, and give us a little flavour of the types of things that you think are broken in the economy and how we might fix them.
Well, thanks, Paul. And look, this very much reflects the conversations that you and I have had. I think the reason I wrote the book is that we're at a particular moment in the history of our societies, and I think it is actually a relatively unique moment where we've got a long-term inequality crisis, which I know the administration in the US is trying to confront. We have obviously the recovery, the need to recover from the pandemic, and all of the challenges that's thrown up. And then the impending climate crisis, which is upon us, but will only get worse. And I think the reason I wrote the book and the central philosophy of the book is I don't see how we can look at those challenges and think to ourselves, well, the answer is small solutions. We need to go big in the solutions we offer. And I would make this point to you, and it very much speaks to the US experience. If we don't go big, if we don't offer big solutions, if people who want those challenges tackled in a rational, pragmatic, sensible way don't offer big solutions, then what's been called the morbid symptoms will come along, President Trump, and offer solutions which are not solutions at all and deeply destabilizing for our society. So I think it's the right thing to do, and it's also the necessary thing to do given where we're at. And so that's really what the book seeks to do. And it looks around the world and says there are big solutions to so many of the problems that we face, from climate change to inequality to the problems in our democracies, and also crucially that people can be part of these changes, that people might feel quite powerless. Even some of the people on this call might think, well, I can do my own bit in my own organization, but can it really have an effect? And my answer is yes. And if I can quote another Kennedy speech, which is actually my favorite speech, the Day of Affirmation speech, the Ripple of Hope speech, I mean, that is every time someone stands up for an ideal, they send forth a tiny ripple of hope, and that this can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and injustice. And I think that is, I mean, that's my favorite speech of anybody. But I think it's very apt for the moment.
Absolutely. And I guess if you think back to the economy and economics and thinking big, perhaps the last big thinking was done sort of 40 years ago in the 80s when Milton Friedman's philosophy took root with the politics of the right in the UK and in the US. You've got Reaganomics and Thatcherism, and they did shift economic thinking. And and kind of in some ways we're bearing some of the results of that in the last 10 or 15 years. But I just wonder what you think about the current state of the model of capitalism since it's been through that monetarism stage and really in the investment environment. And I sort of mean, do you worry that it's institutionally set up to fail because of conflicts between things like short-term incentives and long-term needs, or perhaps between different stakeholders, or the demand for perpetual growth, which many politicians and business people sort of seek to be the solution for the future and may not sit within our planetary boundaries, and sort of that balance between consumption and those planetary boundaries, for example?
Well, I think you put it very well, Paul. The way I tend to think about it is that the periods of 1979, or in the US 1980 to 2008, the financial crisis, 1979 in the UK, the election of Margaret Thatcher, 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan, marked an era, an epoch. But the problem is, at least certainly in the UK, is that I think we're sort of in, I guess you'd call it in American sports, overtime of that era. And we're all, I think in different ways, we are struggling to find what the new settlement looks like. And if I can put it this way, Paul, and I think it very much reflects the way you practice business and the way increasingly so many people want to practice business, you and they are ahead of the institutional framework that we have. The institutional framework reflects the previous era. You and other leading business people who are pioneering a different purpose-led approach are in the new era. And I think the answer is that we've got to bring the institutions into line with your practice. And that's everything from what model of company law we have, the way what we ask companies to do in terms of disclosure in the UK, what our takeover regime is, what do we think about the whole issue of short-term dividend payouts. There's just a whole set of issues here that kind of come up, and I think that we need to re-engineer our capitalism. But I think what's so interesting to me about this debate is business people are trying to do it themselves, and I'm very interested in the whole B Corp debate, obviously. But it's almost like the framework holds them back, and I think that's what's got to change.
Yeah, I think you've got it spot on there. I mean, as you know, Ella's Kitchen was one of the first UK B Corps, but now there are banks, there are wealth advisors, there are institutional investors and fund managers across the world that have accredited. But B corporations work within the existing framework. They're sort of the outliers, if you like, in the framework, trying to push the framework, but it's the existing framework. And that there's a debate and some ideas around in the UK about this idea of a Better Business Act at the moment, which has the potential to absolutely redefine what the purpose of business is by removing this idea of shareholder primacy, which B Corps sort of go against and which monetarism went to, I guess, taking that duty of shareholder primacy away from directors of all companies. That's what the Better Business Act is. It's almost to make all companies B Corps, but it really does redefine, or would redefine, what the purpose of business is. So I wonder if you could talk to us a little about your thoughts about that actually changing the framework. Where are the difficulties? What do you see about the future of directors and investors' responsibility if we can amend the framework that companies work under?
Well, look, in the interest of full disclosure, Paul, you've taught me so much that I know about this issue. And I think the Better Business Act is the right way to go. And we have in this country, in the UK, something called the Companies Act, the 2006 Companies Act, Section 172, which does entrench a form of shareholder primacy. And I think, I think you and I know that changing the way the corporate governance regime doesn't change everything. But I think the corporate governance regime and the director's duties do send a very clear signal about what is expected and what running a company involves. And I'm really struck in this debate, and I quote in my book Marco Rubio, the senator and former presidential candidate, not somebody on the left side of politics, obviously, who says words to the effect of shareholder primacy isn't working anymore. And I think it's interesting the way this debate, whether these ideas start out on the progressive left side of politics or not, you hope they end up being in the mainstream and accepted on all sides. And I think, I think that's the prize here. But I think it starts with what directors' duties are and that whole agenda. But I think, and this is something that we're working on as a party, I think there's a deeper set of issues here. The kind of finance that is available to companies, and whether it's patient capital or impatient capital. As I said earlier, the takeover regime that we have, which in the UK is structured in particular ways, and means companies can often be sort of carved up. The role of workers and whether workers have a role on company boards and so on. And this is a debate that is very much flowering in the US, the work of Elizabeth Warren and others pushing this debate forward. So I think this is a debate whose time has come. And look, I think in a sense, capitalism goes through this remodeling every era. And you had the remodeling under Ronald Reagan, obviously, previously the remodeling under the New Deal. And I think it's often not appreciated about Roosevelt's New Deal that it wasn't just an economic stimulus plan, it was a rebalancing of where power lay in companies and the purpose of companies. And I think there's lots to learn from that.
Mm. So if we can get a reframing done, if the policies you and your colleagues are putting together get to a place where we reframe the economic system, what does our economy look like in terms of the ability to create wealth and equity for all rather than just for some? Do you see a whole rebalancing between the social contract between society and business, and how the economy and society sort of fit together?
Well, I think I think you are so right about this, Paul. I mean, just to tell a little sort of anecdotal story that, I represent, for your viewers, I represent a constituency in the north of England. It's a town called Doncaster. In the Brexit referendum of 2016, my constituency, this wasn't my preference, voted significantly, more than 70% for Brexit. And, this is a sign of the discontent there was. It's really important to say this, that some people will think, well, was that just an anti-European vote? It was much deeper than that. It was people saying, I want a new beginning. I think it's what we would call inclusive capitalism, frankly. A system, an economic model that gave people a sense that they were included, that they had a stake. And I think that, for me, that is, that what's the purpose of all this? It is about the climate, obviously, as well. But as far as equity is concerned, social equity, it is about everybody having a stake in the system and the system working for people, not to their detriment. And that's what lots of people, I think, continue to feel about our economic system. And so I think it's modeling a system that is, yes, companies making profits, and yes, companies having purpose, and it's that combination that I think is essential. And I think capitalism is incredibly dynamic. Markets are incredibly dynamic, but they need to be situated within a set of social relations, a social context which guarantees fairness. And I think that is essentially what has got lost. And I think it's this these markets that can feel out of control without the kind of proper rules guaranteeing fairness, that lead us into all kinds of trouble. And I think it's that re-engineering that is really required.
Let's just pick a couple of tangible things maybe that's happening right now that could be, as you were alluding to there, one of Bobby Kennedy's ripples of hope in changing, building waves to change the economy and society. Let's look at the fight for one fair wage in the US. I know you know a little bit around, and I know it's a core thematic area of the RFK campus investors as well. And what I know it seeks to do, the fight for one fair wage, is to end the sub-minimum wages in the US and increase the sustainability of wages and working conditions, especially in the service sector, where tipping is can be a tool for wage abuse, I guess, and for discrimination. So I know through your political career and through listening to the podcast so often that you know a lot about fair wages and recognizing value and the importance of dignity at work. And I wonder what you thought about this campaign, and any analogies to what's happened in the UK with our minimum wage work.
I mean, in the book, and you and I have talked about this too. In the book, I talk about the fight for 15, and I think the fight for 15 is a sort of an extraordinary story, because in a way it relates back to what I said earlier, which is people can feel very powerless, but actually people who are organized can do extraordinary things. And I'm so struck by this that it was 200 fast food workers who went out in New York, I think in 2012, saying $7.25 was not enough to live on at that level at that time, the minimum wage. And the fight, the $15 minimum wage was seen as outlandish at that time. It was a doubling. It certainly wasn't on the Democratic Party agenda, never mind the Republican Party agenda. And here we are, less than a decade later. I think it's 22 million American workers are covered by a $15 minimum wage. It's Joe Biden's policy, and sure, he's having trouble getting it legislated to have it as the federal minimum. It passed, I believe, in a referendum recently in Florida in the 2020 election. It's the subject of lots of sort of platforms, party platforms in different states. And I think, what do we draw from this? I think we draw a couple of things. First of all, about the importance of the dignity of work. And I was involved in something called the Working Families Tax Credit, which is broadly speaking like the earned income tax credit in the US. And I very much defend what tax credits have done in this country for social equity. But I think there's something about the wage and the right to a fair wage rather than, or not simply a top-up. I mean, the top-ups are important, but the wage recognizes the decency, the dignity of work. And I think there's something very, very important about that, which we sort of need to, we really need to take to heart. So I think the first thing is about that. I think the second thing is just about this sense that, change looks impossible until it happens. It can look like it's just outlandish, never going to happen. You see it in the divestment movement too, around fossil fuels, and people think, well, that can't possibly happen, and then it does. So I think examples like that, examples like the One Fair Wage campaign, are really, really inspiring and important examples.
They are those little waves that eventually bring huge change, and they start sort of from the bottom up, if you like, way away from the politicians, where that movement starts. And I know you're really big on the power of change makers and on those sort of bottom up movements to shift the needle on that status quo. So I wonder how you see this ability to shift norms from a shareholder advocacy point of view, and how small shareholders can drive positive change in investment decisions by either asking the right questions, by divesting, by building ESG into their portfolios, and drive better companies, better economies, and a better world. Talk to us a little bit about shareholder advocacy.
Well, I think it's such an interesting area, Paul, because I think this is an area where we're probably at the foothills of what is achievable, actually. We have an organization in this country, as you'll know, called Share Action, which works with individual shareholders and others, people worried about where their pension is being invested, to encourage them to put pressure on. And I think, of course, like the big institutional investors have an incredibly important role. And I think it's really important to sort of recognize that. And I think institutional investors who are doing the right thing, pushing for climate integrity, social equity, and so on, I mean, that's so important. We'll have lots of those people on this call. I think there is also the scope, though, and I don't know what you think about this, for more of a popular movement of people. I think most people are incredibly passive shareholders when it comes to these ethical issues, but they probably, if they were given the information, were kind of had their consciences awoken to some of these issues, would want to be involved. And I think it goes back to something you said earlier, which is, the direction of travel here, I think, is not just the heavy hand of government wanting this to happen, or even enlightened business people. I think it's where employees are. You'll know this from your employees at Ella's Kitchen. It's where the public is. I think the public think, well, we want capitalism that makes profits, creates wealth, creates jobs, but we don't want it harming people or planet.
Yeah.
We want it doing the right thing for people and planet. And so I think I kind of feel like there's a latent potential, and I talk quite a lot to the person who runs Share Action in the UK about this. I feel it particularly in relation to climate, to be honest, that I feel like most people would care where their pension fund money is invested, and very few people ever stop to think about it or get involved in it. And there are some nascent campaigns around this which are trying to mobilize people, and I think they have huge potential.
I know that in the US, there's a push by the SEC to mandate disclosures on human capital. For example, the NASDAQ's board diversity proposals recently won SEC approval. But in the US, there's sort of a real history of hurdles, regulatory hurdles, and adoption is slow relative to the EU. And where the EU does have mandates and things get through around transparency and ESG matters. So coming a little bit more helicopter than that specific issue, but do you have thoughts on the opportunities to harmonize regulations around the world, especially around ESG, and perhaps better standardize or even define what metrics need disclosing, given that we live in a single global economy where capital can go anywhere?
Well, I think this is really interesting. And funnily enough, Paul, I've been doing a speech today about the, when this goes out, we'll be in the middle of the COP in Glasgow, the Conference of the Parties, the big climate event. And one of the things that I was saying was that the UK government is moving on the question of disclosure for companies and financial institutions around climate risk. And that's a good thing. And that work's been led by Mark Carney, the former Bank of England governor. But disclosure only takes you so far. You need disclosure, but also a transition plan consistent with 1.5 degrees and the Paris Agreement. At least that was my argument today. And we've said that by 2023, the UK government should be asking large financial institutions and indeed the top 100 companies at the least to be saying what is their 1.5 degree transition plan. Lots and lots of businesses, as you know, are doing this and are ahead of the game. But the reason why it's interesting in the context of the question you ask is that, we really need this done in all the major financial centers. And so, this is, and honestly, I'm a believer in government and the role of government, but the billions that government can put in, whether it's dollars or pounds, is as nothing as the trillions of private finance and the effects that it can have. And I would really say this sort of in all sincerity to the people who are watching this, particularly asset managers and others, will never tackle the scale of problems, crises we face as a country, UK or US or as a world, with the public sector on its own. We just have to be realistic about this. But the power of business, finance, and government together, I think definitely could surmount many of these problems. And but I think you're right about this. The power of this, you need leadership, because often people say, well, why would you do this unilaterally? But I think if everybody hangs back, it's never going to happen. But you need leadership, and the power of example. But it will be an absolute force multiplier if this is done. For example, what I'm talking about in the major financial centers, because then you're really talking about directing resources, for example, of financial institutions into the green economy and away from fossil fuels.
Yeah. I think what you were talking about today is really about collaboration, was a key word that I took out when I heard it on the radio. The mindset move from competition to collaboration, really, whether that's between governments and between countries or within companies and within sectors. Sectors move forward when an amount of collaboration happens. And you just look on a high street of two restaurants. Restaurants are better off starting next to other restaurants because you've got a community and you've got a destination there. So, are you optimistic about the outcome of the meeting in Glasgow? And I really get the point that it's billions that governments can organise, it's trillions that business can organise, and when you look at the biggest economies in the world, half of the top 20 will be corporations, not companies. So they have to play their charts. But are you optimistic that the collaboration between governments and then within the economy and businesses will deliver?
I mean, it's such an interesting question, Paul, because I think it's a sort of paradox, really. I mean, this is definitely, you can look at the glass as half full or half empty. I mean, in one sense, we've come so far on the climate crisis in the last decade. The politics are still difficult, but many more countries are focused on it and recognize it as a massive issue. The economics has moved in the right direction, with renewables now being cheaper than fossil fuels all around the world, and therefore really transforming where the economic logic lies. The science is so clear, and 1.5 degrees, keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees, which a decade ago was seen as again, it goes back to something I said earlier, it was seen as on the margins of the debate, is now a central policy of the US administration, the UK government, and many others. So in one sense, we're further on, but at the same time, we've lost another decade, and we're in a terrible race against time, really. This is not, all the issues we've talked about are incredibly important and need to be tackled, but none of them have the character of climate, which is the decisions we make in the next few years will have implications for the next few thousand years. Because once we use up our carbon budget of 1.5 degrees, which we will do if we carry on with business as usual in this decade, we'll use it up within the decade, then there's no going back, really, or at least not foreseeably. And so it's a massive race against time. Look, I want to be optimistic. I think Glasgow will be the beginning, not the end. I think we won't make the progress at Glasgow, which means we can then take our foot off the accelerator. We'll have to really put our foot down on the accelerator. But I was saying today in the speech I was giving, we can't let happen after Glasgow what happened after the Copenhagen summit of 2009, which was another one of these international climate meetings which didn't go well, is everybody to feel demoralized and nothing to happen for a number of years. We've got to press on really hard. So I think that's sort of honestly what I feel. I mean, if there's one reason I'm back in frontline politics, because I was leader of the Labour Party, as you said in the introduction, then I was a backbench MP after I lost the election in 2015, and I've come back into the more frontline position, is because of this climate issue. And I think every day, am I doing enough to tackle it?
Well, I think, you're an example of humanity just there, what we need in terms of, we're demoralized, yet we're resilient, yet have come back with, new ideas and a determination and optimism that we can get there. And I guess, as we've just spoken about, it's about collaboration and the understanding that everything is connected. A healthy economy with healthy businesses has to rely on a healthy planet and healthy communities and people. And they can't operate independently of each other. Look, Ed, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for not only your time now, but dedicating your life for improving social justice, for having that resilience to try again and standing up and being counted, and really doubling down on the need to go big and share ideas of how to fix the world. And I'd just like to thank everyone for giving up part of your day today, for joining us at our RFK Campus Live, our virtual fireside chat. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul.